Welcome to the Working Genius podcast, where we discuss anything and everything related to the 6 types of working genius and how it impacts your work and your life. I'm Pat Lencioni, your host, joined by everybody in person in the office. We're crammed in the podcast office here in Lafayette, California, the worldwide headquarters of the Table Group. I've got Bo, Tracy, and Cody here. Matt's producing. Karen's sitting next to me in a taller chair. She's above me, looking down on all of us. And so, Cody, what are we going to talk about today? What's the title?
Pat, before we do that, we've been calling the Utah office the worldwide headquarters. So this is now the satellite office. Okay. So just so you know, it's great to be here at the affiliates. We are talking about the prophet in your own backyard.
Yes, from the Bible, right? You can't be a prophet in your own backyard. And how does this relate to working genius? Well, so often, and we had a great conversation in our office this morning, all of us could relate to this. Mm-hmm. And that is the people that know us best, usually in our family, our spouse and our closest friends that have known us for years, they often don't recognize our geniuses. And we feel like we have to advocate for them. And there's something really frustrating about that. We did a podcast called The Things That You Crave and What Crushes You. And one of the things that really crushes us is when the people that know us best discount that we have working geniuses, and we have to argue for those, or we have to try to demonstrate them. So that's what we're going to talk about today. And everybody we know feels this way. Mm-hmm. What's ironic is the people in this room never do that to their spouse, of course, or to other people they know, but it just happens to us.
Right.
So because we are so aware. Anyway, what's this all about?
Yeah, I think that there's 2 parts to this. Some geniuses, or maybe with some relationships, whether it's a team you're working with or a family member, it might be that your genius is sort of taken for granted.
Yeah.
And that might be too true, especially for somebody, Joe in our office was talking about, as somebody with enablement and tenacity. It's just kind of assumed that Joe will always do that enablement and tenacity work, that it's not. That it's just kind of taken for granted. Hey, he's always going to do that.
He's going to come alongside. He's going to finish whatever he says he's going to do. Super reliable, super helpful. Yeah. That's just who he is.
That's just Joe. Mm-hmm.
He doesn't need to be appreciated or celebrated for that. It's just what he does naturally.
And I wonder if that's especially true. Let's do this live for enablement. Do you think that feels especially true? That's, they're just kind. They always look out for me. That what does that person with enablement crave? You're maybe most likely to not feel seen or appreciated by the people closest to you. Did I get it right, Karen? Is that the thing that they crave? Okay, doing
appreciation.
It live. Appreciation.
Yes.
Right. Well, and the one thing, now I don't have enablement, so I can't speak for you guys, but the one thing about enablement is we know when people do it for us. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
You know, like my kids will say, hey, thanks, Mom, for making breakfast, or thanks for picking up this or cleaning this for me, because they can kind of tell that it happens. Mm-hmm. But I do think you guys get very overlooked for it. I think most people with enablement, people just think, well, you just do that because you just like to be nice.
Well, and certainly in families, as a parent, you're sort of expected to enable your children.
Right.
So it's especially hard because it's a gift of mine. And as a parent, it's a role that I play with my children. So it's especially painful when they overlook that, you know, and they often do.
Right. And as someone who does not have enablement, who as a dad does need to enable our kids. I was doing something today, getting my son cleats because he needed them for the next game. And why didn't he tell me 2 weeks ago? But anyway, so I'm out there finding cleats for him. And so that's not my nature. Mm-hmm. But you are like, could you just recognize this? But they're like, well, but you're a dad. That's what dads do. And it's true. Moms and dads do that. But it is kind of nice when they go, wow, that was outside of your comfort zone. Or better yet, you're great at this, Mom.
Exactly.
Well, I think that's why the language around working genius is so helpful, because in many ways, what you're describing is just like, this is the role that you've played for so long that it becomes overlooked. And this can happen on teams, right? Like you could be an inventor on a team and everybody just, without the language, people just look to you for new ideas all the time without a way of appreciating that. And so like you can kind of get entrenched into these patterns, especially in families, where it's like, well, you know, dad always galvanizes people. And instead of it being appreciating the fact that that is a necessary genius for the whole family, it's just, that's the role that you've served in. And so this gives you language to be able to recognize what it is and appreciate it.
Yeah, it'd be great if a whole family sat down and looked at one another and said, literally, it would be just this, like, hey, Bo, hey, Dad, you really are great at coming up with new ideas. You do it all the time, and you are a genius at that. And I love that you're like that. It's one thing to say, hey, thanks, Dad, but it's another thing to recognize that you're great at it. And of course, doing this for your kids is huge.
Or better yet, the prophet in your own backyard is probably like the opposite of that, which is, you're always coming up with too many ideas, you know,
Yeah,
like, or
that's so
it goes
true.
even too far to
Yes.
say, hey, could you stop? Like, could you stop always being the person that galvanizes us or motivates the family? Or could you stop coming up with new ideas, or stop using tenacity to make us finish things? Like all of that, they get annoyed by it even.
Wow. And I just realized that that's horrible, because the thing we're best at, it's one thing to say, I love that you do that, Dad or Mom, and man, you are so good at it. Sometimes you do it too much, but you're right. Oftentimes they lead with, gosh, it drives me crazy. I'm an ID, so I'm a problem solver. You come to me and you tell me something, and yes, I deviate toward, I try to solve the problem, but I'm usually pretty good at that. And sometimes people don't need you to solve the problem. They just want you to listen. And that is totally valid and totally fine. But it would be better if they said, hey, I love the fact that when I need a problem solved, you're really good at that. I just don't need that right now. Versus like, it drives me crazy how you're always solving our problems.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, does that ever benefit you? And again, I'm not saying like poor me. We do this to one another in our families and our closest friends all the time because we don't see them as having geniuses. We just see them as doing what they do naturally.
You know, it's interesting. Actual story from a month ago is my brother, who's an inventor galvanizer, is an IG.
He sounds great.
No, you guys are similar. And then I am a discerner galvanizer. And my parents, who very seldomly listen to this podcast, so I don't know if they'll hear this episode, but they called, neither of us are financial planners, okay, me or my brother. But my parents called me with a financial question. And I was like, hey, I'm not a financial planner. I think you should do this. But using discernment, I kind of helped sort through what they were trying to figure out and gave them some advice, only to find out that my parents then hung up the phone and called my brother, who's an inventor galvanizer, who came up with a new idea completely separate from the one that I came up with. And all I wanted to do was be like, hey, all things equal, neither of us are financial planners. I have a little discernment. And Casey's just coming up with ideas. Maybe you go with it. But when they're weighing them exactly the same, you know, it's like, I couldn't, this is the profit in your own backyard thing where I couldn't give them the gift of my own genius in the way that they could receive it. They were fishing for any answer.
Yes. And you know what? You just made me realize that none of us want to have to market for our own or advocate for our own geniuses. We want to, in life, we want people to go, you're good at this. I would like your help. And when we have to try to convince somebody to rely on our geniuses, it feels awful. It is one of the most difficult things I've noticed in my marriage and in my family when I have to sell my genius because what I want, because all I care about is them. I want them to seek it so I can help them. And if I'm using my energy trying to convince them that I have a genius, I feel kind of gross.
Well, even just yesterday, Pat, now this isn't family, but it's people I've worked with for a long time. I'm on a Zoom call and I have this like discernment gut feel about what we're talking about. And I'm doing my best discerner galvanizer, trying to get everybody rallied around like, I'm not sure this feels right in my gut. And then I kept getting resistance. And then during a Zoom call, you know, you open up the little chat and I tried to chat to the person that I worked most closely with, like, am I crazy? Or does it feel like I have to advocate for my own discernment in this call? Now, I don't have tenacity, so I actually sent that chat message to the person I was arguing with. You know, not the person I intended to, which ended up totally fine. It was great. We have a lot of trust and all that stuff. But I've even in that call, I was like, this feels terrible to have to advocate for my own genius in this conversation.
Yeah, think about it. If all of us here had to go into a meeting and at the beginning of the meeting say, hey, remember you guys, I'm really good at and talented at these things. My name is Bo Johnson. I am really good at inventing and galvanizing, so you should probably trust me on that. Nobody wants to do that. It seems awful. And yet we need to for the benefit of the team, but when it comes to people that are really close to us, we really feel bad when we have to kind of remind people that we have gifts.
And it especially feels bad when they're being resisted. You used that word a minute ago. I think it's one thing to have it not be seen or taken for granted. It's another thing to feel like your genius is resisted. I experience this sometimes in one half of my extended family, that the galvanizing is resisted. It's like, no, we kind of want to do this all together and we're going to wait for everybody to be like, I can get us there faster. We can get the whole group moving, but it's not accepted. In fact, it's worse than that. It's almost like you were in that call, Cody, bumping up against a wall that somebody doesn't see it and resists it.
Well, and it makes sense in the context of a meeting. I would think of this ridiculous analogy, like you're on an airplane and somebody fall sick and they ring the call bell. They're like, is anybody on the airplane a doctor? And then Bo will raise his hand and we're like, not that type of doctor, Bo. But imagine
theology.
But imagine if that were like, we need this genius. And then you like the doctor comes up and they're like, no, not you. Are you really a doctor? They're questioning it. But
Right.
Yeah.
but in that moment, this is what we need. And you have that to offer. And when it's resisted or you have to fight for it or advocate for it, it doesn't feel great.
And I don't think anybody is immune to this. I'm sure that my wife and every one of my kids in my family feels like I don't recognize their genius because I've learned to take it for granted or I'm just too close to them. And then you go to work and you meet somebody new and you have to get to know them. So you actually try to interpret them in that way. Because I know that I don't overlook other people's geniuses as much at work as I would at home.
Right.
And vice versa.
Well, it's making me think in this conversation, okay, well, I wonder what genius I overlook the most. And I know my answer immediately of what genius I'm likely to kind of discount or even resist. I'm curious what it would be for you all. Mine is wonder. When we're in the flow of doing work, especially when it's people close to it, and somebody asks a wonder question or, well, what's the problem are we trying to solve here? Or what about it? I'm like, okay, I'm just ready to not wonder right now and just get to work. What do you all think?
Well, I actually think wonder is the loneliest genius in terms of the most easily overlooked. We were talking about this morning in the office that I think that's the one that's hard to see. It happens really early.
Yeah.
And people with wonder probably are the most overlooked in that regard. And people with enablement can get overlooked and taken for granted, but they're doing it. Whereas a wonderer is doing it in their head. Matt wonders all the time, but you can't see it. He's probably wondering right now. And so we don't even know it. And so then he can say something. We're like, where's that coming from?
And then imagine, I was thinking about a wonderer too, like imagine having to advocate and say, no, it's actually so important that we start with the right question. Like they're advocating for their own gift in that moment of like, hey, it's really important that we think about the untapped potential. And I do think they get overlooked often. I think that probably wonder would be mine as well.
Yeah, that's interesting.
So I'm curious, how do you advocate for yourself? If somebody's listening to this and is thinking, yeah, I do feel like my genius is not recognized, how do you show up and advocate for the genius that you have to want to contribute to
I
people
have
around
an
you?
answer because this happened in my house in the last few days. And it's good to be able to say, this is how I feel. Because I actually talked to my wife. For me, it's discernment. So discernment is one of my geniuses. It's not one of my wife's. So we'll be talking about something and sometimes I'll have a gut feel and an instinct about something and I'll see the connection. And I feel like she's saying to me, prove it. And I'm constantly arguing with her and she's saying, yeah, but prove it. And rather than saying, you have to trust my discernment, it's better to actually be so vulnerable and to say, sometimes I feel bad because I really want to use my discernment for the good of the family or for you. And I feel like I have to argue for it. And I don't want to have to because I really want to use it for your benefit. She could hear that better. The worst thing I can say, which I have said before, is, but I have it as a genius and you don't. You know what I mean? And I don't lead with that. But at the very end of the process, I'm sure like other people are like, yeah, but I have tenacity and you don't. So your plan, we're never going to finish. So at the very end, I suppose you can get frustrated and almost weaponize it. But if early on in the process, you can say, it is really hard for me because I want to use this gift I have for the good of the family and I feel like it doesn't get tapped into.
I think that's a great suggestion. The other way that I've seen it even play out in my relationship with my wife is sort of the treat others the way you want to be treated. Like I will ask for her genius, like, hey, I really need help getting this through to completion. And on my own, I don't know that we're going to get this calendared. I don't know that I'm going to get this done. Like, can you help me with that? And when you start treating your family members or your team members where you're inviting their genius, just this morning, my wife, this is the weirdest example of like, we have this very, trampolines are already dangerous. They've made our trampoline even more dangerous by surrounding it with cinder blocks. And my wife's like, I need your discernment to help us figure out how to protect our kids around this trampoline. I was like, oh, that's so fun. She wants me to try to solve the problem.
Don't you love it when people ask you that?
It's amazing. And I think that the more that we can in our families and in our teams ask other people for their geniuses, it starts to create that environment where they're going to ask you to.
Yeah, seek to, as St. Francis says, seek to understand more than to be understood. Start with saying, I'm going to get better at appreciating their geniuses rather than you need to appreciate mine.
I love that.
Make sense, Bo?
That's great.
All right. We were all looking at Bo.
We're all in the room together. We're not used to this.
What do I do with my hands?
You know what people don't realize is that our computers have shut down 4 times in the middle of recording this video.
Yes.
We don't know why. So we've just had to keep quit and start and quit and start. Hopefully Matt does a great job of editing, so you probably didn't even notice when it happened, but it's been kind of hard to keep this going. Yeah, Bo.
So I'm thinking about one other thing with the people in your own backyard, your family, the people you've worked with the longest is that when you said, Pat, the line that none of us should say is, I have discernment and you don't. The truth is, before we knew Working Genius or had this language, we have all had moments like that of why don't you just see me? We've all showed up to the table with the people closest to us with the worst version of self-awareness. And so we all have that history that's coming to the table too, that I think plays into this of, I know that while I'm not recognized as a galvanizer in my family, it probably came across as bossy for a long time, or like just across as energy and not trying to actually rally. And so they have all that script of 25-year-old Bo and 35-year-old Bo, but that before I had this language to understand the order that, does that make sense?
It so makes sense.
We have all this context and history that we're showing up to not with a blank slate. Whereas when I have a new team member, it's a totally blank slate. I can understand and have context for why they're behaving the way that they are.
Yeah, and it allows you to go back and reinterpret things too, which is really good in a family. When people go, why do you always solve the problem? I used to go like, gosh, what's wrong with me? Now it's like, oh yeah, I'm an ID. Everybody who talks to me, I'm solving problems for them. It doesn't make it right, but at least it explains it. Where I used to think, what is wrong with me? Why do I think I have to do that? And so I think that having these conversations as a family is really healing, and the more we can understand one another, I want to go home and really try to ask my wife to use her W and I more, and I think I think it'll change everything. I'll let you know. Report next time.
I can't wait to hear it.
All righty. Well, very good. That's the end of our podcast today. We got through this. Technology is still working. And we love talking to you guys about this stuff. Any announcements we have to make today?
Oh, we just want to remind our listeners, if you tuned in last week, you heard that we have a new Working Genius assessment for students. And so really, since the inception of Working Genius, people have been saying, oh my goodness, what if I had known about my geniuses when I was in high school or early college? Imagine the way that would change the way I show up to my teams, the way I think about my major and my career. And so Working Genius for students, the assessment is out. You get it's a slightly different assessment with different questions. You get a custom report when you as a student take it, and we look forward to hearing stories and sharing more about that in the future.
And we'll probably be doing a whole episode. Our next episode will probably be about why students can benefit from this. That's for parents, teachers, coaches, and students themselves. So that would be a good episode for a young person to listen to, because it can change everything if you understand why you do the things you do.
In fact, if you are somebody who works with students and you're already using the assessment, we would love to hear your stories. We'd love to hear how it's working. Tell us about the student that you sat with them and took their assessment and got to hear their ahas. We'd love to get to hear more about that.
All right. Thanks, Bo. Okay. And thank you for joining us. We love talking to everybody, and we'll see you next time on the Working Genius podcast. God bless.